There is sometime you see something like this, configure await false or true, or sometimes use it and set it to false or true. But what does it exactly do in background, where I have to use it and where I don't have to use it? This is so important, and in this video I'm gonna explain what the configure await behavior and where and when we have to use it. So the configure await, as its name obvious, is a configuration that's for configure the context switching in your code. And it can set it to true or false, and its default value is true. But what's the difference between false and true? I will explain it. First, I'm going to talk about the false. What if I set the configure await configuration to false? So in first glance, it's improved performance because it's avoiding the context switching. So what's the context switching and what's the case of it? So the context switching happen when you awaiting the code and an asynchronous method trying to execute it. It's switching the context, the code you ran before the method awaited, and if their execution and the context switching or not. This is depends on you set this configure await false or true. If you set the configure await to false, it does not switch to the context you and your code used before awaited, and it's continue the code on the other context. It also avoiding deadlock, which is so important for us, and it's a critical important error which can down our server or application. And the important trick about the configure await false is to only you have to only use the configure await false in library code. So why and what we have to just only use it on .NET library code? Because on the other scenarios you may have an application which have a UI thread or main thread. When you set it to true, you have to set it to true. It's continue on that UI thread, and the results and data which have made some UI data and something like properties of the UI you had, maybe the color of the background or color of the foreground or font or something like that you may had in UI thread. And when you set it to true, you also had the uh, you have these properties values, and this is so important because if you set it to false, it's switching between another context that your code's values and results does not exist on the context, and it's caused some deadlock and thread starving problems. So um, by this explaining, you may guess when we have to set our configure await to true. So it's obvious that I'm explaining about it here. So if we set the configure await to true, it continue the context on the code on the context before awaited, and this is so downgrade of performance in library code, I mean. and its default value, and it's not a downgrade, but if you set it to false, it's an improvement. And as I mentioned earlier, and I explained about it, you should set it to true when you have a UI thread or main thread scenario. This is so important, as I explained a little bit before. And something is remaining to explaining. It's what is the context. I'm gonna explaining about what's the context, and what's the definition of a context is. Uh, so the context is, if I'm explaining in an image, the context is where your code is executing, and this is important because if you switching between the context, the environment your code is executing can be switching, and you may have some switching between the context and the places your code is uh, executing is maybe different, and the values, maybe the value types, the reference type can be some differences between the context, and um this is important. I'm in the places in the environments of the code and threads. It's naming the where your code executing, where you're awaiting that. But I explain, and the code and the image you see here, when we have a code named do work async, we have a context A that where code on do work async trying to execute it. When we are waiting and writing tasks that run, the context is switching to another one, and a new context has been born and set switching to context B. And in context B, the code block of tasks that run will be executed, and some work will be executed, and it means the environment that we trying to executing our code in tasks that run will be changed, and the rather than context A and the where the do work async executing. And in this scenario, the context switching in it's happened on different threads, and it can be handled in different threads, and it's also impacting on the setting the configure await false or true. As I mentioned earlier, as I pointed out earlier, context switching have some um, price for the systems you working on and the code you're executing on, and it's important to settings context switching false or true, and continue your code on the captured context or not. This is important because it's impacting on your performance of your code, and this is so important to set it false if you have a library code, and set it to true if you have a main thread or UI thread in your codes like ASP.NET, or UI thread like WPF or something like that. Have a great time, and that's it. I think it's enough to talking about the context switching and configure await. Have a great time. Goodbye.